Welcome. I'm David K9AT, and I'm a licensed amateur radio operator. Have you ever known a ham operator? Chances are in your lifetime you knew a friend or a family member that was a ham. What kind of personality did they have? They were probably quiet and kept to themselves. Well, there's another type of ham operator, and that's me. I'm an Elmer. It's a term in the ham community that describes an outgoing person who's a teacher, a mentor, or as I like to think it, a ham radio evangelizer. I earned my first ham license as a 15-year-old 47 years ago. I took a break or sabbatical from ham radio for a few years to date and have fun with cars. But in the back of my mind, I was always thinking about ham radio. Well, fast forward to 2011 when my mom died of cancer. Using her death as a springboard, I decided to get back into ham radio in a big way by putting up a tower that I've always contemplated in the back of my mind for a long time. After all, this isn't the dress rehearsal. This is life, and you've got to live it while you're here. I share this story with you because, unlike most hobbies or sports, there's no upper age limit. With this hobby, you can take it with you to the nursing home. Currently, there's over 780,000 hams in the United States and 3 million hams worldwide. So you have a lot of other hams to communicate with. For this presentation, I'll use the term ham radio and amateur radio interchangeably because they are one and the same. Amateur radio differentiates from broadcast radio in the following ways. With broadcast radio, the FCC allows a station to generate revenue using the frequency they sold to the license holder. On the other hand, amateur radio operators are not allowed to accept any money for their services they perform. For this volunteering, the FCC allows ham operators to use the ham radio frequencies for free. So, where did the term ham radio come from, anyways? It's an interesting story. The word ham was the 1908 station call of the first amateur wireless station operated by the Harvard Radio Club. They were Albert S. Hyman, Bob Elmy, and Poogie Murray. At first, they called their station Hyman Elmy Murray, but later they shortened it to the word ham, and the name stuck. Hiram Percy Maxim was the father of amateur radio with his first transmission using his spark gap generator transmitter. The transmission was received by the first radio receiver called the Cohair. With his invention, he was able to transmit a signal over the Atlantic Ocean from America to Europe using Morse Code, and as they say, the rest is history. The first message was sent in Morse code. Now we call it CW, or continuous wave. We still use CW to this day because when signals are weak, a beep is easier to hear than a voice. Kids always get excited about Morse code because they think it's something secret. Well, it isn't secret because if you know the letters in Morse code, then you can decipher the message. The voice modes or speaking into microphone came later. Breaker, breaker, 1-9. You got a copy on the One Road King? Good, buddy. For those of you who remember the CB craze from the 70s and 80s, it's a radio that can be mounted in the car with an outside antenna. You can talk to your friends that had their CB radios in their own cars. So what's the difference between CB and ham radio? Like CB, you can mount a radio in your car with an outside antenna to talk to other hams. The difference between CB and ham radio is the distance you can cover through the use of repeaters. What the heck is a repeater, you may ask? A repeater is a place that has an antenna on a tall tower or a tall building. When you transmit up to the repeater, that is at the higher elevation, it rebroadcasts your voice simultaneously to a receiving radio in another vehicle. This repeating of the signal from a higher elevation allows your signal to go further than a transmission from a car to car. You can operate a ham radio similar to a CB without using a repeater, but your transmissions won't go as far. This is called operating simplex. CB is still around, but with the advent of cell phones and people wishing to keep their conversations private, it's less popular than once was. Wait, I thought with ham radio you can talk around the world, not just locally. Well, stick around, and I'll share the rest of the ham radio magic. But before I begin, let me clear up some common misperceptions I hear about ham radio all the time. I hear ham radio is really expensive, right? Well, like any hobby, it can be. Take, for example, boating. You can either buy a rowboat or a tricked-out bass boat. You can catch a fish with either boat, but one makes catching that fish much easier. At a certain point with any hobby, there is a point of diminishing returns. In other words, you could spend more money, but you'll only get marginal benefits. I feel you can get a decent ham radio setup for under $1,000. You can also buy your equipment on the used market too. You need one of those big, ugly towers, right? Well, sort of. First, there's two types of installs, mobile install and a base install. This picture is a base install. As a ham friend used to say, height is might, or in other words, the higher up you go, the better you'll be heard. Here's another example of a base install, or you can simply use a wire connected to the top of a flagpole. This will get you on the air too, but not like a tower. So, is this what my ham radio room in my home will look like? Really? No, absolutely not. This is a typical ham radio room, or as we call it, a ham shack. You can simply use a spare bedroom in your home for the ham shack, or you can find a corner in your basement that isn't being used and set up a desk and put your equipment on that. Don't you need to know Morse code to get your ham radio license? Nope. You no longer need to know Morse code to get your ham radio license. If in the past you were ever considering getting your ham radio license but couldn't learn that Morse code, this is no longer a barrier to becoming a ham operator. There are those people in life that simply can't learn Morse code, so they remove that requirement. You have to be really smart and techy kind of guy to get your ham radio license, right? Well, this couldn't be further from the truth. Ham radio operators come from all walks of life in every profession imaginable. All that's required is a sincere interest in radios and a willingness to learn. Elmers like me will guide you as you learn. More on this later. You must build your radio equipment, right? Well, initially that was the case many, many years ago. And while you still can build your radios, if you're ambitious, you no longer need to. There are radio manufacturers out there who build good quality radios at reasonable prices. Like all retail stores, ham radio stores have sales on Black Friday and the other usual retail sales dates. Now that we've dispelled the misperceptions about ham radio, let's explore what you can do in ham radio. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, because I probably missed some activities. But here's some activities that you can do in ham radio. Let's begin. First, there's Skywarn. This is using your ham radio to do weather spotting, helping out the weather bureaus, giving exact locations of your weather events. There's community service. You're giving back to the community, supporting various events using your radios, providing communications for such events as the Chicago Marathon, Trek 100, and Tour de Cure for Diabetes, as an example. Contesting or radio sport. There are various contests, all with their own rules, but this makes using your radio a competitive event. DXing or distant talking around the world. We'll talk more about this later on. Special events like 13 Colonies. In this event, you contact an official radio station for that state, and then there's 12 more to go. Then, when you find all the official state operators, they email you a PDF certificate of completion, suitable for framing. Kit building. Well, this is for the person who's tech-minded and likes to build things. Once again, you don't have to build your radios as you once did. Antenna building. This is a fun activity, learning about RF, creating antennas out of the leftover parts that you have in that bottom drawer. Satellites and working the ISS. This is an astronaut from the International Space Station talking to ham radio operators on Earth. You can reach the ISS with just a handheld directional antenna and a walkie-talkie. The trick is knowing where and when to point the antenna. And you guessed it, you can download an app on your phone for finding the ISS and the other satellites. Talking to other hams. When we are not operating our ham radios, we like to get together and eat and talk about, of course, radio stuff. Hotspots to access all the RF digital networks. You probably see a Raspberry Pi in the plastic case, but attached to the top of the Raspberry Pi is an RF board that is a mini repeater, but for the digital modes. This is one of the activities that interest me in ham radio. Fox hunting, finding that hidden transmitter. Well, one ham hides a transmitter, then the group of hams with their directional antenna tries to find it. The transmitter doesn't transmit all the time, making it more of a challenge to find. Triangulation is the method used to locate the hidden transmitter. Poda, meshing radios with nature. This is my all-time favorite thing to do. You go out to a designated Poda site with your radio and set up a portable antenna. Then you let all the Poda chasers know the frequency you are on through the Poda app on your phone. Then they all call you all at once with their radios. You try to pick out the call sign in the mass confusion. It's called a pileup for obvious reasons. When you're finished, you submit your logs and earn certificates for your accomplishments. In northern Illinois, these are the official designated Poda parks. There might be one near you. Volobog in Volo, Moraine Hills in McHenry, Chain of Lakes State Park in Spring Grove, Illinois Beach State Park in Zion. So when you're in one of these parks and you see someone operating a radio, say, how many contacts are you making on the Poda activation? Then the ham will smile. And then there's Hamfest. This is where you can do a variety of things, including buying and selling radio equipment, either new or used, possibly upgrading, taking your next license test, attending ham radio forums to learn something new in amateur radio, and finally hanging out with your friends, eating a lot of food. And some of these ham fests are multi-day events, so you stay in the hotel and invariably geek out. Hey, Eric, did you bring that adapter we needed? Oh, I forgot. Dope! And lots more. If I ever hear a ham operator say they're bored with ham radio, well, they haven't tried everything that ham radio has to offer. So how do I get started in ham radio? Well, unlike CB radio, amateur radio does require a license and some study. To get started, you buy a license manual. In the license manual, there are a pool of several hundred actual test questions with the company answers to get your license. The test will have between 35 and 50 questions depending upon the class of license you're going for. The passing grade is 70%. You then study or memorize the answers and take the test. This probably doesn't sound right on the surface, giving you the answers ahead of the time of the test, but I'll explain their reasoning. It's kind of like OJT, on-the-job training. Once you pass the test, you apply what you learned being a newly minted ham. Then you fill in the knowledge gaps along your ham radio journey. In the old way, the course material was presented, but the actual test questions weren't given in advance. The passing success rate was much lower with that previous method. Thinking about it more, if you don't pass the test after several attempts, what's the purpose of maintaining your interest in ham radio? Ham radio licenses are incentive licensing. The incentive to pass into the next license class will give the ham operator additional frequencies that he can operate on. Each license class has its own license manual to study from. First off, there's the technician class. This is the beginner license. You will receive all of the local communications plus some of the long-range privileges. The general class. This license builds on the technician class license and adds some more long-range operating privileges. The amateur extra class. This is the top tier license in the amateur radio, and you have access to all the amateur radio operating frequencies. So you're ready to take your test, but where do you do it? Over the years, this process has been made easier with the VEC, or Volunteer Examiner Coordinator Program. Amateur radio clubs reach out to the FCC to be certified to administer the ham radio tests. In the past, an individual who would like to take the test would have to travel great distances to the local field office for the FCC. These FCC field offices were typically located in major cities around the United States. This would present a challenge if you lived in rural America. Now that the local ham clubs around the area can administer the test, chances are there's a place near you to take your test. So what is the furthest place you've ever talked to? I get this question asked all the time. But when you think about it, you can only talk halfway around the world, right? And I've done that on multiple occasions. What is all this frequency talk I hear from you, and what does it all mean? Well, RF signals travel in sine waves as shown on the screen. The closer together the tops of the waves are from each other, the higher the frequencies. Typically, VHF and UHF are for local communications, and they are 28 megahertz and higher. HF, or long distance communications, are 28 megahertz and lower in frequency. The magic of long distance communication on HF begins with propagation. The sun completes its rotation on its axis every 11 years. Compare that to Earth that rotates on its axis in 24 hours. One particular part of this sun has solar activities with solar flares that ionizes the Earth's ionosphere. These solar flares emit electromagnetic energy. When this energy reaches the Earth, the ionosphere that surrounds the complete Earth gets ionized. When this happens, the magic of long-distance communication happens. This process of getting reliable long-distance communication is gradual as the sun rotates on its axis. The lull of energy reaching the Earth occurs at 5.5 years in the sun's rotation. Then it builds to a peak at the 11-year mark. Then the process starts over again. The good news I want to share with you, in a year or two, we are reaching this peak, so it's a great time to get into ham radio. The Earth's ionosphere is comprised of various layers: the D layer, the E layer, the F1 layer, and the F2 layer. When the Earth's ionosphere is not completely ionized in low sunspot activity, the transmitted signals leave Earth in a hole in the ionosphere and go off into space. In high solar activity, the radio signals are trapped in the Earth's ionosphere and ricochet between layers. This is called RF ducting and results in worldwide communications. The sun isn't the only thing that affects propagation. The weather plays a part in it too. Early on in TV, before cable and dish, you would rely on a TV antenna. Occasionally, a distant TV station from another city would appear as you were clicking through your channels. What's appearing on Channel 8 tonight? This would usually occur in the spring and fall, and was a result of hot and cold air masses mixing together. These events are called temperature inversions. Ham radio frequencies are also affected by temperature inversions. When this occurs, hams that would normally use their radios for local communications can communicate with other hams several hundred miles away. The northern lights can also affect propagation. Now this is going to sound crazy. Raindrop scatter. This is an exotic propagation that occurs in the gigahertz bands. Hams who operates on these frequencies are excited when it rains because they actually use the raindrops to make their long-distance communication contacts. So with cell phones, why do we even need ham radio? Well, jokingly I say ham radio was the world's first conference call. Everyone on the same frequency can talk to each other. On some frequencies, the uncertainty of communication is what makes ham radio fun. I use the analogy, it's like fishing without a depth finder. You'll never know what fish you can catch until you drop the hook in the water. Similarly, from my previous discussion about propagation, you'll never know how far your signal will reach until you transmit that CQ, which is a request for a response from anyone. On the other hand, on other frequencies, ham radio is very reliable form of communication that will work when the cell service is not working, like after natural disasters like tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods. Case in point, when Hurricane Maria leveled the island of Puerto Rico, all the cell service was out, leaving the island with no communication. A group of 17 ham radio operators went down there with their radios and ran communication for several weeks to rebuild the island. Are there any side benefits to amateur radio? Absolutely. For young people, it's a great networking tool for making connections with technical jobs. When I interview, invariably, because I list this as an avocation on my resume, amateur radio comes up with the interviewer being curious about it. This creates a talking point to impress the interviewer. Personally, it's opened many employment doors for me. For older people, it's something to stay connected with other people when you're retired instead of watching TV all the time. It also keeps your mind sharp, using your brain to think through things that you are curious about. It's also like being in Toastmasters without belonging to Toastmasters, and I'll explain this. When you meet other hams on the air, it will likely be the first time you'll ever have talked to that person. Because of this, you quickly learn to speak extemporaneously. There's a web page called QRZ to spark these conversations. You simply put their call in the search field on QRZ.com, and their page will pop up. In their bio that they write, there's usually something in there that will align with your interest as a conversation starter. In my opinion, with the advent of cell phones and texting, we've lost our congeniality in conversation, and this helps restore it. If you're reluctant to talk to other people, then there's the digital modes like FT8, where the computer that you're using does all the communicating. So what motivated me to make this presentation? Well, I want to share in the joy I've known of being an amateur radio operator all of these years. Spiro, my Elmer, did that for me, and you can read all about him on my QRZ page at K9AT. It's also kind of a selfish motive on my part because when I'm gone, I want the amateur radio service to live on in the future. So what are your next steps? Well, there are organizations such as the ARRL with lots of resources that you can tap into. There are also local clubs that you can participate in with their monthly meetings. And you don't even have to be a ham radio operator. Just go there as a visitor, and an Elmer will likely come up to you and say, hey, I will support you in your efforts as you continue your journey in ham radio. Are you ready to give ham radio a try? It's an adventure that will last a lifetime. 73, and that means best wishes in ham radio speak. From K9AT.